Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to take our Dash web part, which we've built, and we are going to improve our property pane controls by adding some customization so that we can make a much more user-friendly list picker that'll allow you to drop down a list of lists, if you will, and you'll be able to choose a list from your current web. And then likewise, you'll be able to drop down selected fields and choose multiple selected fields from the list that you've selected up above. This is a technique you could call cascading dropdowns, because what's going to happen is you'll select from the first list, and then the options in the second list will refresh based on the selection up above. This is going to require making some web requests because we are going to need to know what lists are available. And then once you select a list, what fields are available on that list. So we're going to use our abstracted web services class to retrieve that data and actually load that state into our property pane controls. So first of all, let's update these controls into a new format because a text box just isn't going to cut it. So let's open up our -webpart.ts file. And first of all, if we go down to the bottom where our property pane is and we find our list ID field, let's change this to a property pane dropdown because we just want this to be a very simple dropdown menu. This is going to need a list of options, which will be an array just like we had for our chart type down here. However, we can't hard code the options in. We're going to have to send off a web request to actually load up whatever options that we want inside of this dropdown. So let's go ahead and create that now. Now, first of all, whenever you're in your web part entry file, this is not a React component. So we don't have an interface that describes its state. We don't necessarily have a managed way or a planned way that we can deal with the state inside of this property control. So we can really do anything we want in order to do this. But I think a good way to do it is to add some private properties and private variables on this instance of this class, and then use that to actually store what options are available inside of this dropdown. So let's jump up to the top here and we'll add those now. At the top where we have our dash web part, inside of this web part class, we will add private list options. And that'll be of type I property pane dropdown option array. So it's going to be an array of key and text objects. And also we should probably track when that is loading. So just like before where we're giving the user feedback on what happens, what are we waiting on? Let's have an object, let's have a variable here that's going to be list options loading, and that'll be of type Boolean. And by default, that will be false. And we'll just add a comment up here, list options state. Okay, so now that we have these, we have a place where we can store the state for that particular dropdown. We have an array that's going to have the options, and we have whether or not it is currently loading. So let's go back down to our property control, right down here. And first of all, we'll replace this empty array with this dot list options. And we'll also tie its disabled attribute to this dot list options dot loading. So it'll be disabled while we're loading the options. They're going to be in there. Now this isn't going to work just yet because we're never actually modifying the list options array. Right now it's undefined, so you're not going to have any options whenever you try to open this up and see what is available there. So what we'll have to do in this case is create a method that will go out and it's going to get the list options and then set that on our class, as you can see here. So let's scroll down below this method, and right down here we'll create a method called private get lists, and this will return a promise of type I property pane dropdown option array. And in this case, we want to use our SharePoint service. So we'll return SharePoint service.get lists. So we're going to get the list on the current web, and then we're going to take those lists, and then we essentially need to map the list format, which we have an interface for that. It's the iList. It has an ID and a title. We need to map that to an iProperty pane dropdown option, which contains a key and text. So we're kind of just going to transform the list format into a dropdown format. And that looks like this. We're going to return lists.value, which is the array of lists.map. And then for each list, so we're going to return a new object, which is going to contain a key, which is list.id. and text, which is going to be list.title, like so. Let's add some semicolons here. And that should now be complete. So it's going to use our SharePoint service, and we already created that get list method. And we're just going to take our list and map it to this new format where it's going to be key and text, which are going to be the list ID itself and the list title, respectively. And the nice thing about this is because we're storing the list ID, which is what we actually need to be the value of that input, we're storing that as the key. The user never actually needs to see the list ID. They're only going to see the list title because that's the text in this case. So that's great, but this method is currently not being executed. And it's probably not a good idea to execute this every time the web part is initialized. We could use that on-init lifecycle method, but that's probably not a good idea because if the user never opens the property pane to change the lists, that's really just an extraneous REST call that we have to make, an extraneous web service call. So let's avoid that and use a different lifecycle method, which is called onPropertyPane configuration start, which only executes when that property pane is first opened. And then we'll fire off this event to get our lists only when the user actually opens the property pane to make some changes. And that looks like this. We're going to go protected onPropertyPane configuration start. And that is return type of void. And within here, we can say this.getLists. And then with your list options, we'll take those and we'll set this.listOptions is equal to list options, like so. And then we'll also need to run a special method, which is called this.context.propertyPane.refresh. And anytime you're updating the state of any of your controls in the property pane, you will need to run this method. Otherwise, it won't actually update. You won't see any changes. Even though we've changed the list options, that control will never actually refresh, so you'll never actually see them. So make sure you run this to actually force a refresh on that property pane render. And if we come back in here and we give this a refresh, we will hit edit, and you'll see here, it loads in all of our lists into our dropdown that are on our current site, which is great. And you'll see it's already selected lemonade stand earnings because it knows that was the previous value, but I could select something else very easily. Now we're still not handling the loading state. So if you remember, we had that loading variable that can control whether or not this input is disabled. So if we want to do that in our getList method before we actually get list, we can say this.listOptionsLoading is equal to true. And then again, because we're changing the state of our control, we need to refresh the property pane after we do that. And then we'll do the same thing after we successfully get our lists. Let's go ahead and set that back to false and refresh the property pane once again. And now with that done, if we give this a refresh in our remote workbench, I'm going to go to the network tab so that we can test this and put our throttling to slow 3G. And as we open this, it's going to take a moment to load, but you'll see that it was grayed out there for a moment and disabled while it was retrieving lists in this case. Cool. And just a note about this dropdown that we just created, because I feel like I should tell you this in case you don't want to have to do the extra work. In the PMP property controls that you see here, you can also see they have a list picker, which is basically the very same thing that we just built. And you guys are welcome to just drop that into your solution as well. Might be nice to see how it works behind the scenes. We basically recreated this. They probably have some extra bells and whistles like a multi-list picker, but you could also certainly use that if you wanted to. And speaking of these controls, there is a multi-select control, which I really like to use on a regular basis. And this is a great candidate for being able to select the fields that we want inside of our chart. And as of right now, that is simply this text box. So let's work on removing this text box and replacing it with a property field multi-select field. So first of all, we're going to need to import this. Let's give that a copy. And in Visual Studio Code, we'll come up to the top and paste that in here. Let's also go down to the multi-select control itself and give that a copy. And we'll jump to the bottom of our file where we have our property pane controls. And let's replace the text box with this multi-select control, and its target property needs to be selected fields. Let's change its key. I don't know what that does. I think it just needs to be unique, so we'll just call it selected fields as well. It's bothering me that they use double quotes here, so let's change those to single quotes, and we'll change the label to selected fields. And then our options, rather than hard coding those, again, we're going to want some sort of state that's going to control what options there are, first of all, but also whether or not this control is disabled. So we'll have some sort of Boolean to control that, just like we did up above with our options and our disabled. We're going to do the same thing on this multi-select control. And finally, it has this selected keys thing. This should also be this .properties.selected fields. And this actually returns a string array. So the selected keys, the selected fields actually needs to be an array. Right now it's a string that we're exploding into an array. So that's a fairly easy fix to fix this mismatch here. Let's jump up to the top of the file and let's just change our selected fields to a string array in this case. And now when we pass it down to our web part, rather than doing a split, we can just pass it directly because our field multi-select that we're using here is automatically going to handle making sure this is in an array format. And before I get, that means we'll also need to update this in our manifest file. So let's change the default value of selected fields to an empty array inside of the manifest. Great. Okay, so now that that's done, let's create a field options state. So just like we did before with our list options, let's create a couple of new variables called field options. So we have field options, which is, again, a collection of drop-down options, and field options loading, which is a Boolean value. And now that we have these, we can go down to our control at the bottom, and we can replace the options array with this dot field options, and the disabled with this dot field options loading. Cool. So just as before, field options is undefined. It hasn't been initialized just yet. And that means we're going to need to have some sort of method that's going to get the field options based on the currently selected list. So let's go down and create that. Just like we created a get list method, we're going to create a public get fields method. And this is going to return a promise of type I property pane dropdown option array. And it's basically going to be the exact same thing that we had up here. So let's go ahead and copy this. We'll paste it in, but instead of updating list options, so everywhere we have that, we'll change this to field options loading. And instead of get lists, we'll obviously want get list fields. And we're going to need to pass in a list ID, which is going to equal this .properties.list ID. If we don't have a list ID, this is obviously going to fail. So it's probably a good idea at the top of this method to say if this .properties.list ID is falsy. So if it's either undefined or not set, or it has no length or whatever, let's just return immediately. So we don't want to do anything at all. And actually, we should return a promise. So we should probably return promise.resolve. So we'll just immediately resolve that. And that means no list selected. Just put a comment there so we know what that means. And then we get our list fields. And then with our fields, now we're going to set field options loading back to false. And then we're going to take our field, and just like before, we're going to map the fields to a new object, which is going to be key and text. And in this case, it's not a list, but a field that we're mapping over. And our key needs to be the field.id. So that's actually the same it was before. But the text can be anything we want. But we have on fields, we have a title, a type is string, etc. So maybe we want to make this appear as a template string, and we have field.title. But then in parentheses, we can add field.type as string. And that may be useful because we are building a chart web part in this case, and it might be important to know what type of data is in each field, because only certain data types are going to be useful in the context of a chart. Okay, cool. So we have our get fields method, which theoretically is going to return some fields from this. And now we need to call this from somewhere. So this is going to be different. We can't do this just when the property pane first loads because you may not have a list ID yet. And so if you don't have a list ID, this is just not going to do anything. What we actually want to do is get fields every time we change the list to something new. And fortunately for us, there is a special lifecycle method on this web part that we can use for just that purpose. So let's come down here. And we're gonna do a protected on property pane configuration changed, on property pane field change. And this is a special lifecycle event that occurs anytime you change the value in one of your property controls. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this case. This takes a couple of extra things to get set up. We need to accept a property path, which is a string that tells us which property is actually changing. We need to accept an old value, which is of type any, and a new value, which is of type any. And this is going to return void. Now, this will break all of your property pane controls just by adding this method. So to get it working, once again, you need to make sure you call super.onPropertyPane field change. This method handles all the changes that occur in the property pane. So if you just override it and you don't call this super method, it basically breaks all of your controls. So we definitely need to add property path, old value, and new value. So we're just calling the parent method in this case. Cool. And then down here below that, after we handle our normal updates, we can say if the property path is equal to list ID. So if we're changing the list ID and we have a new value, then let's do something. Let's go out and let's get some new list fields. So we'll say this.get fields, then field options. This.field options is equal to field options. And then we need to refresh the property pane. So let's run that refresh method right afterwards. Otherwise, we won't actually see the new values appear. Okay, so let's give this a go. We will save that, and inside of our remote workbench, let's give this a refresh. I'm gonna edit the web part, and you'll see as I change to a new list, we get all of the fields in that list. It's gonna show the field title as well as its type in parentheses right next to it. If I switch to a new list like events, you'll see it gets disabled for a moment, it comes back, and I have things such as the event start time and end time. Very cool. If we go to our lemonade stand earnings, you can see I have the earnings Q1, Q2, Q3, etc. It's looking great. And it looks like there's an error that's occurring when we try to click on these. And I think I know why. It's probably because this was initially initialized as a string. And now we're trying to add items to that string, which doesn't have the same prototype methods. So we probably just need to delete this so that we get the new defaults from our manifest file when we add it back. So let's hit, not refresh, but let's hit lemonade stand earnings, and let's try to check. There we go. Yep. So if you have the same issue where you can't actually select, is because we changed that from a string to a string array. You just need to delete the web part and re-add it back to the page. Let's also delete the local web part and add that one again, because we'll probably have the same problem here. And on the local workbench, we have our sample lists and then our sample fields here, which we can select, which is great. And now let's give this a refresh over here. It looks like I accidentally passed the ID down as the field name instead of the internal name. So that was my bad. Let's go up here and fix that. So in our get field method right here, again, we're mapping our fields to these selected options. So you actually notice in our dev tools, if you look at the selected fields, it's an array of IDs, whereas what we actually want is an array of internal names of those fields. So we'll set this to internal name on that to fix this issue. And just to make sure all these are cleared out, let's just delete this web part again after, and then refresh. We'll add a new web part, and see if we can fix that issue. So we will have lemonade stand earnings. It's a bar chart. We'll select from the lemonade stand earnings list. We'll have year and then each of our quarters selected. And let's go over here and hit refresh. And sure enough, there we go. We have a dynamic chart that can pull in any data that the user selects using this select fields dropdown over here. So if I wanted to uncheck some of these and maybe have the, for whatever reason, have earnings Q1 be our series labels, and then we have currencies listed after that, you would just change the order of your selected fields, and you could just refresh this at any time to always keep your data up to date, which is pretty cool. So there's still a couple of issues here. You'll actually notice that if we go to another list, so maybe I switch to a product development list, and then we switch back to lemonade stand earnings, you'll see these fields are still selected. And even if I switch list to something else, if we look into our React DevTools down here, you'll notice as I select new fields, it's going to add them to our earnings Q1, Q2, etc., which are on the other list. So they're actually, this is invalid because you're not going to be able to select these fields from this particular list because they don't exist. So let's go ahead and fix this. And in order to do this, basically what we need to do is whenever the list changes, we need to clear our selected field. So let's go down to our on property pane field changed here. And we'll just say before we get our fields, we'll say this dot properties dot selected fields is equal to an empty array. So we'll just kind of reset that before every time we change the list ID up here. And then hopefully now, if we hit refresh here, whenever we edit this and we select lemonade stand earnings, and let's just select the first three here, if we switch to a different list and then switch back, they should be unselected, which they are, which works great. Cool. And now very easily, if I want to switch this data that you see here over to a different dummy list that we have set up called produce revenue, I could select the title, January, February, March, and April columns or fields in this particular list. And then whenever we hit refresh, we're going to load in a whole different set of data, which in this case is just the number of apples, oranges, and bananas sold in those months. Very good. Now let's just double check that this is also working in our local dev or local workbench. I'm going to re-add a web part here, and we'll just select some sample list data from our sample fields, our mock fields that we created, and we can see there that this is working just the same. Cool. And just one other issue you'll notice, you see the selected fields over here. If I refresh, and we go into edit this web part, you'll notice that the selected fields don't actually load. And that's because we're only getting the fields from this list when the list value changes to something new. So if I switch to something new, it'll activate that, and that's going to work just fine. But when the page first opens and the property pane first opens, it doesn't actually activate those. So let's fix that as well. We're going to come over into our on-property pane configuration start method, and then after we get our list, we'll say .then. And then once that's completed, we'll go ahead and run the same stuff that we did down below. So we'll get fields, and then with the field options, we'll set field options and refresh the property pane once again. So let's give that a save, and then as soon as we're ready here, we will give this a refresh. And now when we first open the property pane, it'll load the list, and then it'll load the fields down below. And if we select these, let me select the year as well. When we hit refresh, you can see that data. Again, if we hit refresh here, and we first open this, you'll see that they're all selected automatically, even when the property pane first opens. Great. All right, so that's going to do it for these cascading dropdowns in the chart data section of our property pane. This has really improved the user experience in terms of how we can allow users to utilize these property controls to dynamically select both lists and fields on those lists to allow us to customize what is actually displayed and passed down to our chart component in this case. If you found this exercise challenging, that's totally okay. That's very normal. This is a particularly difficult and probably the most difficult thing that we've had to do thus far. We're going to continue to work on other improvements in this web part. So let's think about all the different ways that we can make this even better. And in our next lesson, we'll start to implement some of that.